So several years ago I made this bronze sword, and after several years of metal casting, I want to see if I can make another one better than this. I begin by sketching out a concept that I can use to make a pattern for the blade. Once it's drawn, I cut it out so I can then transfer it to a piece of wood. In this case, I just stenciled the pattern to a piece of cedar and then used a jigsaw to cut it out. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of woodworkers out there who would have 1,000 better ways of doing it than the way I'm doing it, but I'm not a woodworker, so I figured I would just take a sander and sand it down until I had a sword. And all I can say is, it worked better in my mind than it did in reality. I don't think this is going very well. It's hard to keep straight and even, so I think I'm going to make the blade and the handle separate and try to figure out how to join them together. Do I know how to do that? No, but I'll try. So I pulled out my old lathe. I bought this with the sole idea that I was going to turn a cannon blank, cast a cannon that actually worked. That never happened. I'd never even used this thing. The only thing I know about using a lathe, no loose clothing.
And no loose clothing. Possibility.
I did my best to find center and mount it into the lathe. Now it's all experimentation for me. So with just me and my Harbor Freight chisels, I'm going to try to scoop away everything that doesn't look like a handle. I will say it is kind of a fun process, but I'm not going to give the most glowing review to the Harbor Freight chisels. I feel like there's better options. There's gotta be. So I've made several handles here. They all feel a little different, but they're all perfectly round. I kind of want to go for an oval handle, so I'm going to experiment with maybe how I can turn this into an oval. With the table saw, I tried to cut off some of the edges of the handle so that I can oval it out and make it maybe a better shape. I thought that by putting it back on the lathe I could knock off the corners and kind of oval it out a little bit more, but that's not really how that works. A lathe is for making round things, not ovals. Well, I don't really like how that looks, or how that feels. Thinner handle I guess does feel nicer, but it's too flat. I don't like it. It's not really an oval, so we'll try another method. It's important for me to document what works and what doesn't work because it's all part of the process. I'm not a master bladesmith, so I'm figuring this out and I want you to see how I get it done. Now, I've never carved a spiral before, but I thought if I wound a string around the handle, I could space it out nice and even and then draw a line where the string was. That would give me a nice path to carve the spiral and keep everything looking good. Now you might think by this handle being bronze that it's going to be a lot heavier and bulkier than it needs to be, but when I look at a lot of ancient bronze swords, they do cast the handles in bronze, and some of them have very ornate patterns. So I'm going to do the same thing here. So these spirals do feel a lot better. It helps it lock into my hand. Kind of like how that's going. So with my first attempt, I can tell the blade isn't really even. Just kind of freehanding the line. So what I did with this one is I rounded off the edge with the lathe, and now I know it's perfectly symmetrical on both sides. Now this handle I kind of like. So now I'm going to use this piece and work on just the blade and then try to figure out how to attach it to the handle. By cutting it in half, I kind of hedge my bets, so I'll have two blanks to work with, just in case the first one goes wrong. Now without the handle, I'm thinking it'll be a lot easier to shape. I'll square up the sides because the edges are rounded from the lathe, and once that's done, I'm going to add some straight lines down the center and down the side. And that'll help me keep things straight when I thin and shape the blade. I experimented with using a planer for part of it. Mixed results. I used a rasp for some of the shaping. and I used some small carving chisels to add some contour to the blade. The blade is getting close to the right shape and size. I want this to be just as combat ready as it would have been in the ancient days. So I don't want it too heavy, and I don't want it so thin that it would just bend as soon as it got hit. However, I'm not really sure how thick the blades were in ancient days. Let me ask ChatGPT. How thick were ancient bronze? It's amazing, it just comes right up with the answer. The thickness of ancient bronze swords varied, but generally were around 3 to 5 millimeters. That's really thin, holy cow! It means this sword needs to get a lot thinner. With a little more work on the blade, I then moved on to the handle. I need to separate it and start shaping the handle so it's ready to attach to the finished blade. Once I draw in my center lines, I'll use those to help contour the blade and keep it as even as I can. Then I'll trace exactly where I want the blade to sit and start carving a notch that the blade will fit into. Cedar's a little bit harder wood, so I'm going to switch to a Dremel and see if that works any better. It's a bit aggressive, but it gets the job done, and any gaps I'll fill in with wood putty. So the blade will attach into the handle like so. I don't know much about balancing swords. Right about there is the balancing point. And I know you kind of want to have the weight balanced in your hand. So that means either I need a bigger pommel or I need to thin down the blade. I have a little extra here that I'm going to need to cut off, which means the balance is going to be even more into the blade. So I'm going to keep thinning the blade a little bit. Try to get that balance a little closer to the handle. Now with the handle, this spot right here, it just looks a little plain to me. So let's spruce it up. To spruce it up, I just printed off the Trinity symbol and cut it out with an X-Acto knife. I then placed them exactly where I wanted them to go and used a little bit of super glue to get them to stick. Now I had my pattern, so I took my Dremel and drilled away all the wood that didn't belong where I wanted it. I then used a small chisel to try to even out the Dremel marks, followed by a little bit of sanding. With that, it's time to attach the handle to the blade. So I took some epoxy, mixed it up, and that will hopefully be strong enough to hold everything together. I do my best to align everything as well as I can, but the only thing I have to do that is my eye. I'll add one coat of paint just to smooth and seal the wood, and then we'll be ready to go. So with that, I think the pattern is done, and I think it's time to cast it in metal. Now this doesn't lay flat, and I don't want it to bow as I put the sand on top, so I'm going to make a false cope. By making a semi-firm bed of sand, I can press the sword into it, and that should hold it and cradle it so it doesn't bow when I pack the sand on top of it really hard. The red sand here is brand new Petrobond. The darker blackened sand is old recycled, but they're both oil-based sand. Well, that didn't pull away very well at all. I don't think I packed it hard enough, and the bottom of the sand might have been a little too spongy. So I'm going to rough it back up just enough for me to press the sword back in and start over. That looks a little bit better. I'll clean this side up a little bit and then redo the other side so both sides are clean and packed firmly. Now I'm going to be doing a vertical pour, so I need to put a backer on there to hold the sand in place. Otherwise, when I poured it, the sand would just burst out the sides. At this point, I should have a nice clean parting line and a good clean impression. Now, I'll carve a runner a little bit down the handle to hopefully avoid some of the turbulence, but I'll leave a big riser on top to account for the shrinkage that I know is going to occur. For this casting, I'm going to mix up some tin bronze. It's the same alloy that they used in ancient days. I'll make this one about 90% copper and 10% tin. My fittings had gotten loose and there was propane spilling out my burner. Not a bad idea to check those every now and then. But I tightened it up and we're back in business. Once the copper is completely molten, then I'll add the tin. The tin melts instantly when you put it in the melt. It's kind of fun to watch. I'll scrape off the dross, and now we're ready to pour this thing. I'm going to set it in a bucket of sand just in case anything leaks out. So we had a blowout. There's a lot of metal here, and that means a lot of hydrostatic pressure. Should have had more clamps on it. It almost looks like the blade cast completely though. Not quite. You can see right here is where the leak happened. There got to be too much pressure and it pushed out that thin side. So close. It almost filled all the way up and then it started leaking right there. The reason I carved the runner here is because I didn't want all the metal going down the same way the air was coming out. It causes more turbulence and can lead to more flaws. I was hoping this would give a more gentle approach, but it got so close to the wall of the flask that it leaked out. Overall, the blade looks pretty good, but there are flaws and inclusions, and there are the most right here, and that's kind of the area where the metal would be the most turbulent. I also see around the guard, it's got a lot of shrinkage, and you can see at the end of it, there's a huge hole down the center. That's all metal shrinkage. So I'm going to need to make a bigger flask that will allow a more laminar flow to minimize that turbulence and to make a bigger reservoir for metal because it's going to shrink a lot. This flask is just going to be made out of 2x4s. I'll make it bigger, but not too much bigger because it takes a lot of sand to fill a big flask. So once again, attempt number 3, it's the same process as before. But this time, I'm hoping the bigger flask make things work better. I don't have a board big enough to completely cover this, but I figure a few pieces will still add enough support so it doesn't blow out the side. There's a little bit of overlap, so I'm going to carve that away so the parting line is right down the middle of the blade. Adjustments like this are also one of the reasons you'd use a false cope. Then I destroy the false cope, and you might be asking, is it really necessary to go through all this? Couldn't I just keep this side of the blade and cast it as is? And you're right, I may be able to do that, but I do believe that this way gives it a better result, especially since I already made adjustments on the lower half. I carved the runner at the side of the guard just like I did before, but I also want to try some other methods of doing this. I'm also going to try another pour going directly down the center of the handle. They say that's how ancient people did it, that's how I did my last one, and I want to compare the results to see if there's a difference between this method and that. The first blade will get cut back up and remelted. Perfect, no leaks. I put a ratchet strap around this to hold it a little tighter. I guess it worked because it didn't leak. I should use more clamps though. As soon as that blade was done, I immediately went back to try another one, this time pouring directly down the handle guard. You can hear the metal splashing around as I pour it down. Unfortunately, we had another blowout, about the same exact spot as the first one. I'll explain why, but I wasn't quite satisfied with either of those blades, so I wanted to try one more method, this time trying a horizontal pour. Well, a horizontal pour on a slant. And I gotta be honest, this was hands down the best result. Side by side, you can see the difference between each different method, but the winner clearly stands out. The first one was a vertical pour, and I tried to have the metal going through this spout and into the guard here, hoping that gave it a little less turbulent flow. But you can see right at the guard there is a lot of sign of turbulence. There's a place in the blade here where it just didn't fill out all the way, and looks like a cold shut right there. Definitely some unfortunate flaws. So then I tried a purely vertical pour, and unfortunately, right at the pommel, it failed. But you can see the whole blade has issues. There's a lot of inclusions in it. There's a chunk at the tip that didn't form. I think it's a loose piece of sand that blocked the metal maybe. And the Trinity sign got worn away completely. And there's some shrinkage around the guard as well. Now I've been told this is the way they cast them originally, vertically. But when you do that, all the air is coming up. It's very turbulent on the way down, and it just doesn't seem like a good way to cast metal. So I tried a slanted pour, hoping it gave a much smoother path for the metal. I put a riser on the guard to help avoid some shrinkage, and a big riser on the pommel. And I also added this little basin, so when the metal comes in, it fills up the basin and then goes out, which again gives it a more laminar or smooth flow of the metal. And this turned out beautifully. It is so much cleaner. So in my opinion, this is by far the best way to go about it. At least out of the 4 examples I've done so far. Let's clean it up. I'll very carefully use the angle grinder to cut away the sprues and risers. I try to keep a steady hand because when you slip and hit something wrong, it cuts deep. But there's a lot of metal to get through here, so power tools are kind of the way to go. It makes me wonder how the ancient people actually did cut away the sprues. Every time I think about how they did the amazing works of art that they did, I'm just amazed. No power tools, just an incredible amount of patience and an unbelievable amount of skill. After the angle grinder, I switch to a little more precision, so I pick up my Dremel. And whoops, that's not supposed to happen. Stuff like that makes it scary, and that's why I always wear eye protection anytime I use these kind of tools. So with a tight grip, it's back to the angle grinder. I have to re-establish the round shape of the pommel I designed, so corner by corner, I start working on those edges. When it's close enough, then I take out a grinding wheel and keep working. And finally, down to the files. It's the slowest but most controlled way to work the metal. The flashing along the handle is taken off the same way. For the riser on the guard, I went from the grinding wheel, and then once I got close enough, back to the file. So that handle is feeling really nice. It locks in place, it's a good grip. I like it. But we have a problem that needs to be addressed. When I cast the sword, I had a riser coming up from the guard, but I ended up getting a little too much shrinkage. And I don't want to just keep filing down and have a big gouge in there. But I also don't want to see this shrinkage, so I'm going to try to hide it with some peening. The peening will add a texture that'll still look pretty uniform, but hopefully hide that divot just a little bit. So I think the texturing looks a little bit better. One of the unfortunate things about the Trinity symbol here, some of the sand pulled away from one of the lobes. So I'm going to take a carbide bit and try to Dremel out that metal from that lobe. My engraving tools are kind of limited. The Dremel does work well, but it's hard for me to keep a nice square edge. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. I think it's better. My engraving skills need work. Alright, now is one of the most important things to do with a bronze blade. Work hardening the edge. Bronze is a soft, malleable metal, but when you peen it, all the molecules kind of lay in orientation, and it makes it a heck of a lot stronger. So what ancient people would do is they would peen all along the edge of the blade, hardening it. The center would remain softer as to keep it from snapping. You don't want it too brittle, but the edge would be hard so it would retain its sharpness. So I'm going to very carefully peen the edge with a ball peen hammer. Look at that. I had this little drip that I hadn't trimmed off, but when I was peening, that vibrated and snapped right off the tip of the sword. Well, that's okay. I'll just file it down to a little bit more of a point. Now, one thing I find when I peen the edge is I'm struggling with keeping the blade straight. It's kind of warping one way and the other. Kind of peen one side and then the other and it bends back. So I'm trying to keep the blade straight. I wonder how straight ancient blades were. Once the edges are peened, it's time to start sanding. I want this one to shine. I'll use a sanding wheel for the rough sanding and then go down to hand sanding. I didn't show all of it, but I did mix in some sandblasting along with filing just to get it cleaned up more. To sharpen the blade, I just took a hand file and started working on the bevel. A few too many slips and scratches, so I decided to put some masking tape over the polished side of the blade. Next I want to add some color to the handle, so I'm going to take some liver of sulfur and add a patina to that textured portion that we did. This metal is cold, and as you can see, it's not doing anything when I put the patina on. Putting it in the cup of warm water seems to work pretty well, but I realize I need to heat this whole thing up. I want to heat the handle up just enough to activate the patina, but I don't want the blade to get too hot. If it does, it'll darken, and it could possibly also temper the blade, which means that it will lose the strength of that work hardening. But it only takes a gentle heat to give it the color I need. I'll go back over it with one more round of sanding just to give it its final shine. And I'll use a sharpening stone to give it its final edge. And then we're done. This blade took a lot of time, and again, I learned a lot in the build process. The total weight is 4 pounds 3 ounces. It's actually a little bit heavier than my first blade, and it's not perfect. There are some casting flaws, but there were casting flaws in ancient blades too. Maybe not as pronounced, but still. Compared to my last blade, I think this one is a step above. The look is a lot better, and the overall feel and balance feels a lot better, even though it's a little heavier. I still can't imagine fighting with a blade like this. It's amazing to realize that people actually did. But you guys let me know what blade you think is better. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.